Hello, I'm Rick Sinding. It's Wednesday, the 22nd of June, 2016, and we're at the Eagleton Institute of Politics on the campus of Rutgers University. With us today for the Center on the American Governor is David Rousseau, whose career spanned nearly 30 years in state government, dealing primarily with budget and fiscal issues, both at the executive and legislative branches. His experience includes time as a budget and fiscal analyst for the state Senate, a special advisor to the state Senate president, and then over on the executive side as deputy treasurer in the McGreevey administration and as state treasurer in the Corzine administration. David, welcome to Eagleton.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
You began your career in state government in 1982 with the Election Law Enforcement Commission. Tell us a little bit about how that came about.
Yeah, I'm one of those people that started as a quote lowly intern, and then left as state treasurer. But I was finishing up my.
But that's over 30 years.
That's over 30. That's over 30 years. Yes. But I was finishing up my my education at Temple University. I was looking to do an internship at that point in time. I was looking in Philadelphia, I was also looking in Trenton, and I had sent a resume to the Election Law Enforcement Commission, and they were about to do a report on the 1981 gubernatorial public financing of the primaries and the general election. I had written a paper on public financing at the federal level, and they saw that on my resume, and they brought me in. I helped on the research for that report, and that led to a few positions at ELEC, and I stayed at ELEC for 5 years until January of 1987, and then I moved on to the state Senate.
And that was in an interesting period when the whole idea of public financing of gubernatorial elections had just taken hold, and the idea of legislative elections they didn't get state money, but they were required to file where the money was coming from and how much they were spending and so forth. A very early harbinger of the election laws that that came into being at all levels and then got struck down by the Supreme Court.
And at that point in time, there's on the legislative side, and any side, legislative, local office, county office, or whatever. There at that point in time, there weren't even any contribution limits yet. At that point in time, because the only contribution limits were in the gubernatorial, traded off against the acceptance of public financing. It wasn't until the early '90s when contribution limits were placed on legislative candidates and candidates all the way up and down the ballot and the county committees.
And in those days, as I recall, for the 1981 election and again in '85, both the Republican candidate Tom Kean and the Democratic candidates Jim Florio in '81 and Peter Shapiro in '85 accepted public financing, didn't they?
Yes, yes, they did. And then in '89, both Jim Florio and Jim Courter also did that.
When did accepting public financing go out of vogue? I guess
I'm trying to think historically. It may not have been until John Corzine and Doug Forrester, because I'm thinking '93 Whitman Florio. I think they both did.
Yeah, I think so.
'97 Whitman McGreevey. I'm almost positive they both did. 2001 McGreevey and Schundler. I'm not sure if Schundler did or didn't, but McGreevey. I think did, and then so 2005 it could have been
Corzine and Forrester.
Right. Yeah. But I think but primaries, most of the candidates have taken it as well.
Yeah.
I mean, Corzine didn't, but he didn't have he did have a token primary, if I remember correctly.
All right, so 1986, 87, somewhere around there, you make the shift from ELEC over to the state Senate. How did that come about?
I was, it was time for a change at ELEC. It was time to do something different, and I had a number of people who that had moved on to different places. One of them had moved on to the Senate. I was interested in looking at more policy-related areas. I had interviewed actually in the Senate Democratic office a few years prior to that, and didn't get a job mainly because I was told I hadn't paid my political dues by working on campaigns and things like that. But working at ELEC. It was a catch-22. I couldn't work on campaigns, but so I again reached out in 1986 is when I reached out, and I started the interview process with then Senate President John Rousseau and the executive director at that time, Kathy Crotty, and that process took a number of months to finalize. But in January of '87, in late '86, they offered me a position. And John Rousseau, then the Senate President, had changed the dynamics, I think, of how partisan offices were staffed, and how the Senate operated. He really tried to make it more professionalized. So it wasn't, just people who had paid their dues politically. There was, that was part of it. You had to be a Democrat to work there. But, what you've done
to work on the partisan
Right, to
state.
work in the partisan, to work in the partisan offices. But he and Kathy really developed. I think if you look, developed more. Also looked at the professional side of it, and looked at what you could bring to the office professionally from a policy side and the work. And if you look at what happened in that late late 80s, 87, 88, 89. If anybody ever takes a look at the staff that Kathy and John Rousseau hired and looked at the staff picture, there's a staff picture that was taken like sometime in 88 or 89, and you have two people who went on to become state treasurer, me and Sam Crane. You have two people who became chief of staffs, Jamie Foxx and Tom Shea. You had people who have become well-known lobbyists in healthcare, other issues. You have people who become national political consultants and regional political consultants. It was a staff that probably, in my humble opinion, is second to none on any group of people that's ever been together as a professional staff.
Well, it's interesting because that time period seems to be a time when not only the Democratic partisan staff, but also the Republican partisan staff and the nonpartisan Office of Legislative Services all increased or improved their standing and began to make a major difference in terms of the development of policy.
Yes, I agree with that. I think what it was, you have to remember at that point in time, the Senate Democrats were in the majority. The Assembly, it was under the Republican control, and
a Republican
governor. So that Senate Democratic staff was really the only. Yes, you had the Assembly Democratic staff and the Assembly Democratic staff there as a minority staff, but that group of people was the group of people that was really developing Democratic policy for the senators who were in the majority, who actually had more of a say in how the state was going to move forward in that second Kane administration. But you're right. I definitely saw that when I came in, and how over that period of time the professionalism and the growth in the staffs, and that it's needed to try to go toe to toe with an executive branch, and even then you're still not going toe to toe.
When you began, I assume that but at this point your expertise clearly is in campaign financing, which you've been involved in for the last 4 or 5 years. But your position, did it morph into budget and fiscal affairs, or were you hired specifically for budget and fiscal affairs?
I was hired. That was a point in time, again, as you mentioned, the staff was needed to grow and become more there was more workload. At that point in time, it was decided that one person couldn't handle the budget side. Sam Crane, who later became treasurer, was then the budget director for the Senate Dems. And the decision was made to bring somebody in. I believe that, I think that when they looked at my record, my background, it wasn't just my background in campaign finance, it was more of my ability to analyze, think, do math,
Right.
Things like that. So I came on board to work with Sam specifically on the budget. And that was really, I think, the turning point, the beginning of a career that then stretches another 20-some years on the budget. A lot of times, new people on staff come in, and this is no offense to some of the other committees, come in and may work for a starter committee, something like law and public safety or state government, don't get the opportunity to come right in and start working on the budget.
Right.
I was lucky enough to come in January of '87, right at the beginning of the year. Tom Kane delivered his budget address. That was when it was still in January, 3 or 4 weeks later. So I hit the ground running, and that first 6 months of doing, I just learned, I just really sat back and observed as much as I could. But in that 6-month period, I learned so much about the workings of state government dealing with the budget, and then it just grew. It grew there. But I was hired actually specifically to do that. Now, being someone who had campaign finance background, I also did some of the work on campaign finance issues during that period of time, and later on became one of the key people when we were working on campaign finance reform. But I was brought in to help, to help Sam and have a second person deal with the budget issues.
So you arrived as the fiscal 88 and then fiscal 89 budgets were being presented by Tom Kane.
Yeah.
At a time when the state was, I don't want to say awash in money, but I mean certainly in comparison, there was plenty of money available at that point. And I don't recall there being any tremendously contentious issues that arose between the Republican governor and the Democratic Senate over budgetary issues.
No, I think those two, so it would be fiscal 88, fiscal 89. I think were pretty pretty straightforward. I don't think there were major issues there. It was just really came down to the horse trading at the end about what legislators were going to get what special programs in the budget, and other the governor's the governor being able to keep his priorities. I mean, the first time where you start to see a shift is in fiscal 90.
For
so
sure.
That's when Tom Kaine's last budget, where he proposes it in early '89, and then through the spring, the revenues don't meet projections, and we first have to scramble to actually rebalance a budget, and it was actually one of those times when it was one of those nights. I think we didn't actually fiscal 90, which is June of '89. I don't think we passed a budget technically until sometime on July 1st, as we were negotiating with Tom Kaine. And it was a three-way negotiation. It was a negotiation not only with the governor's office, but you also had to get the Assembly Republicans to agree. It was also an election year for the gubernatorial election, and it was an election year for the Assembly. It wasn't an election year for the Senate.
And the Assembly Speaker was running for governor at the time.
At the time in the primary, yes. And the Assembly Democrats saw it as an opportunity to, to basically, they weren't going to give any votes. This was going to be a budget that was basically passed with Republican votes in the Assembly, mostly Democratic votes in the Senate, with some Republicans ultimately, since Kaine agreed to most of it, going on. But I still remember, late at night, I believe it was, Senate President John Rousseau on the Assembly floor lobbying his two Republican assemblymen, because he was in a split district on that point in time, lobbying his two Republican assemblymen to provide the votes to at least to get the budget passed. And I think it passed at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning on July 1st, and then the governor signed it right away.
Maybe the first time that happened, but it certainly wasn't the last.
And then what happens after that is, as that budget moves forward through the year, it starts to have problems, which then lead into the transition period between Jim Florio and Tom Kaine, and some of the problems that Jim Florio faced when he first came in, about not only having to propose a budget for the next year, but also to have to do some triage to the current budget. And I think, as far in my career, that was the first time that there was that type of triage had to be done to the budget that had been adopted. It became something of a normal occurrence after that, and especially for the last decade, even more so. But that period of time, 1989, the 1989 Kaine last term, and that first 2019, which was the 1990 fiscal year budget, is I think where the things start to turn. You also have the first time the Unemployment Insurance Fund was, people forget that was the first time the Unemployment Insurance Fund was ever tapped to help balance the budget. I think it was later ruled unconstitutional on how we did it, so future administrations figured out a different way to do it. But that budget did include that.
The Jim Florio famously said in the 1989 campaign that he saw no need for raising taxes or raising the income tax or doing any such thing. And Governor Florio, to this day, maintains that the Kaine administration had told him throughout the fall that the budget would be balanced. There were no hidden problems, and yet reporters and pundits at the time were saying, quite frankly, that the first thing that Florio was going to have to do was to raise taxes. So, what was the feeling among the Democratic legislative staff at the time? Did you see the handwriting on the wall? Did you see a disconnect between what Florio was saying in the campaign and what he was likely to face when he came into office?
I think there's always a different perspective from what's going on in a campaign from what's going on in the staff offices, and what reality is and what may occur. Yes, I think people realize that there were some deeper fiscal issues, not only in our how costs were rising and our revenues were leveling off, and the specter of potentially having a court decision on schools. It's interesting when Tom Kaine does his. I think I personally believe he was one of the greatest governors we ever had. But his closing State of the State speech, when he talks about the need for us to do something on education, on the education formula, and he had 8 years to do that and really and really didn't. Just battled in court, and as he's walking out the door, hey, you got to do something about school funding and property taxes. So I think that people knew that there were these, you had this underlying issue of costs starting to rise at a faster rate than our revenues were.
And a recession beginning.
A recession beginning. You had the specter of a school funding issue. You had the issue of rising property taxes in New Jersey starting to get more of a steam than it had before, and that was partially because of what was going on with school aid. So you had the recognition that maybe something that the old homestead rebate that it was established when the income tax was created in 1976 or 77, whenever that was, probably wasn't enough anymore for middle class families. So you needed to start looking at that. So you had the convergence of all those issues, and I think people started. Sam Cray may have said, you had people starting to look at these issues. But what goes on in a campaign is different. It sort of mirrors what happened in. We'll talk about this more later. It sort of mirrors what happened in 2001, when there was what I call a cone of silence or something on how bad the state's fiscal situation was during the McGreevey-Schundler race, and people knew it was bad, and but just nobody talked about it. And then later, it became very well known a couple days after the election. But we'll talk more when we get.
We will. Well, in the meantime, in early 1990, as Jim Florio becomes governor, one could make the case. He took the bull by the horns. He did two things. He did a number of things: auto insurance reform, assault weapons ban, a few other fairly substantial initiatives. But the big one, the one that really came back to haunt him, I would say, was a significant increase in the state income tax, extending the sales tax to items that previously had not been taxed, and anticipating the Supreme Court decision on school funding, coming up with a completely new formula through the Quality Education Act for how public schools were going to be funded. One of the key factors there was that the state was going to assume a greater responsibility and bring property taxes down. And I think the Florio administration felt, certainly Doug Berman, who was the treasurer at the time, felt that the balance over a period of time and the reduction in property tax to go with the increase at the top of income taxes would prove to be popular, and it didn't. Why do you think that was a misjudgment? Well, let's begin. What was the legislative reaction? How did you, working with the Democrats in the state Senate, have to deal with this very, very large package of bills, fiscal and budgetary bills, that the Florio administration put to the Senate? How did you deal with that? How did you deal with individual senators whose districts may have been affected both positively and negatively by these changes?
Yeah, I think that, in any administration, the first year, sometimes the governor is usually given the benefit of the doubt. And I think that, he had won a pretty significant victory. He had brought the assembly in with him, which may have been at the end, looking back on it, may have been a bad thing, to have total control. That if he had to negotiate something with a Republican assembly, maybe it would have been more. There probably still would have been tax increases. They may have been more moderate. But I mean that period of time where he ultimately does a $2.8 billion increase in taxes to, like I said, just fund what we were normally doing in government, the assumption of some local costs to help bring down property taxes, and anticipating a Supreme Court decision. I think people at that point in time were concerned about the magnitude, but they saw the overall package, and so okay, maybe this isn't that bad. The problem was whether it was sold effectively. I think the income tax increase at that point in time maybe impacted 10 to 15% of the population. But if you went out and asked 10 people on the street, 9 of them were probably going to say it was going to increase their taxes, when actually 8 of them it wasn't, because of all the other things, all the other noise going on the sales tax and other things. Right. But it was a difficult, and then it ended up passing. I think one of the things that didn't help, again, the selling of this may not. I think the legislators and the legislative staffs thought there would be more of an effort to sell this before and after. Should we have brought the state to crisis first before we Did that? Maybe. Look, hindsight is always 2020. People say hindsight is always 2020. Hindsight is better than 2020 because you know what actually happened. It's better, so, thinking back, you can always second guess, how it was played out. I mean, one of the things that didn't help in that whole process was you had a united Republican Party on, Chuck Attai and Bob Franks, folks like that had done a really good job, and just, and they saw this as an opportunity to, they saw the legislative elections coming up in 2 years where both houses were going to be up, and they had been working grassroots to, they started working grassroots to have people ready, and so they stayed on message. I think one of the things, and no offense to the people that did it, I think one of the things I think that hurt Democrats in that process was when the taxes passed both houses, and there were a certain number of staff people from the Ford administration in the chamber that were applauding. I'm not sure you should be applauding, the increase of $2.8 billion in taxes. I do remember as the Senate was discussing these taxes in caucus, and I remember a senator who was running for re-election. He had just replaced. I'll use the name. It was John Girgenti. Senator John Girgenti had just replaced the mayor of Patterson, who was also a senator and who died, Frank Graves. So he had just moved up. So he was going to have to run in 1990. At the time, he didn't have an opponent.
91.
No. He was have to run a special election in 90.
Special election.
This is when we're voting. This is when we're voting on the taxes. This is the year we're voting on the taxes. There were a few people who actually ran in 1990. And he raised the issue in caucus. But the key thing of this is he was running unopposed at that time, I think. Maybe somebody later comes in, but he says, "Look, I have I'm running for election this year. Maybe I shouldn't vote for this." And I think somebody in the caucus, and it may have been John Rousseau or John Lynch, who said, "Well, John, you're running unopposed. If you have concerns about these taxes, maybe we should all have concerns about the political impact of it." Now, again, thinking forward, that was again a very sage comment. I mean, the problem I think that occurred was that that we went out and did a package that said, we're going to raise taxes by $2.8 billion, and we're going to, in return, you're going to get all these good things that happened. Well, if you're going to raise tax, if you're going to do a package that raises $2.8 billion, you better be darn sure that it actually raises $2.8 billion. And as we discussed earlier, we were actually in the midst of the recession then. It didn't raise anything near that. So the next year, Jim Florio has to come in and propose another budget that wasn't, you'd hope that after raising all that money, the next year you'd be able to do great things and give everything to everybody and and we couldn't. We were again faced with significant issues, and look, I think the signs were there in 1990 when Ed Salmon was running in the first district for Senate. I think he was a replacement senator, and he was running for the first time on the ballot and was soundly defeated. I mean, we all know what happened to Bill Bradley by trying to not address state issues. A little-known Somerset County freeholder named Christy Whitman almost took down somebody who in 1990 was probably a higher profile presidential candidate for 1992 than Bill Clinton was at that point in time. And she almost took him down because of the underlying anger that was out there, and that coincided with a change that really that $2.8 billion tax increases had long-lasting effects, in the Democratic Party's thoughts about taxes, had long-lasting effects on people on what it did. Look, 1991 comes and we lose. Not only do we lose senators and we lose the majorities, we go to irrelevant. We become veto-proof. I mean, Republicans get veto-proof majorities.
Did anybody that you recall anticipate that? I mean, history seems to suggest that there were two factors that played major roles in the anger. That this was, to some extent, a harbinger of the Tea Party. That a new radio station comes on the air, 101.5, New Jersey. An anonymous or unknown postal worker calls in and starts a movement with his first phone call called Hands Across New Jersey, which just takes, I mean, I have to full full disclosure here, I was working in the second floor of the State House at the time, and there was a huge rally, most of it aimed against Florio's increase in sales taxes for items such as toilet paper. We had enough rolls of toilet paper thrown through the second floor window of the State House to last us for a year, because people were just up in arms about this and being fed by a real grassroots movement. The other element that I think came into, that people began to realize much later, was the extent to which the National Rifle Association had been mobilized by the assault weapons ban to very, very quietly but very effectively put money behind the Hands Across New Jersey movement and Republican candidates to run against the Democrats.
I've had that conversation with many people over the years, and that's, I think that, if you, look back, I think that's what John Lynch, who was the Senate president at the time, thinks that, that if not for the Republican establishment and the NRA, Hands Across New Jersey may have collapsed on its, that you needed that support from them, and that anger was built up from within that group of people who then used, the NRA never really attacked Jim Florio on guns. They attacked him, they helped attack the, on the taxes. Yeah, you had 1015 starting with their at the curve point, where anybody could call in and say anything. Think back at I can just imagine the things that have been said over the last 30 years on that station that were totally true, totally false, but people hear it and think, oh my God, that's the truth. And the Trentonian also at that point in time became more of a, I'll say this, became more of a rag. They had the Page 6 girls. They had, they were focusing on, lunch. They focused on expenses. Lunches for legislators. Things like that. You had that convergence of that, and you're right. It is actually a forerunner of, when you think about what later became, a decade later almost, becomes even longer than that, becomes the Tea Party, and it was dealing with that. Like I said, you go into 1991, where 1991 becomes the first year where I actually became budget director. Sam Crane had left. Sam had left in 1990, first to become deputy chief of staff, and then in 1991. Was the treasurer, and that was not an easy budget. That was the really that Jim. I look at, and again, I believe Jim Florio was also a very good governor too. And but Jim Florio was the first one who really ever used what we now call a major non-recurring revenue. So in other words, or a budget gimmick, or something like that.
Selling a piece of the interstate highway,
selling a mile of the turnpike.
Right.
No, of the road that the state owned, that's past exit 18, back to the state for $400 million. And you think now about what has happened ever since then. Almost every budget since then has been relying on some. Look, that budget also that. But to his credit, people. This is something that people totally forget about that budget, is that Jim Florio realized, and his administration started to realize, that the cost of employee benefits was starting to, because at that point in time, healthcare costs were increasing by, double digits every year, and so you had not only the cost of your active employees, but your retirees as well. And he was one of the first, he actually proposed in that fiscal, so it'd be 1991 to be that fiscal 92 budget. He actually proposed that state employees start paying for a piece of their health care. The Senate was more inclined to go along with it, because I think we had some people like the then Senate President John Lynch and others who thought that, hey, yeah, this is something that maybe the employee, it's not the days when state employees were very low paid and the benefits were needed to bring it up. Hey, state employees and teachers and everybody were getting fairly well paid, and
the state workforce had increased substantially during the Kane administration.
But the Assembly, was not willing to go along with it. And in that budget, the friction that happened in that, only people who were inside realized how bad it was. The friction between the two houses.
And this was at the time when they were still both in Democratic hands.
Yes, this is the spring of '91. So we're about to, we're about to run for election. But the tension during that budget process was, like I said. The Senate was more inclined to do some of the healthcare cost things. The Assembly wasn't.
Now, was this in your
judgment? The relationship again between the two houses, the leaders of the two houses, was not good. The relationships between the relationship between the houses were not. There was a point in time where I think the final negotiations on the budget took place we were in one room. the Assembly leadership was in another room, and Sam Crane, Rich Keevy, who was the OMB budget director, and maybe somebody else went back and forth between the two rooms to finally work out a deal. We went as far as the Senate went as far that year to go into committee, and really I think more or less to get the process moving, because it was a stalemate. We weren't going anywhere. Mm-hmm. The Assembly had put a bill out that we weren't willing to. The Senate wasn't willing to accept. They had put something on the table. So the Senate Democrats decided we put a bill out of committee that would have actually not sold the road. We basically said we're going to up the ante. We're going to not sell the road. We're going to not sell the road, and we're going to make $400 million in cuts to state government. We're not going to make them specifically, but we're going to tell the treasurer and the OMB director, hey, once this budget's done, you have $400 million in savings you have to find throughout the budget. That brought everybody, and it served its purpose. Mm-hmm. But it was very tough to get.
So there's real brinksmanship going on.
Yes, but it was actually, I remember that committee meeting where we did it. We got all the Democratic members to agree to it because we said, look, this isn't going to actually happen. We're 99% sure this isn't going to happen. And we actually even got one or two Republicans to it. But that bill, that was in the days when the committee did things differently. They would vote to have the chairman introduce a bill. Now the bill is introduced first, and then it's voted on in committee.
Wasn't there a joint appropriations committee at that
went away, and that went away in '86, basically, when the two houses. One house became so. This is
But even when Democrats had control, it was still separate appropriations committees?
They still kept separate appropriations committees. Mm-hmm. I think later in the process we started doing some things together for public hearings. But initially it was two separate committees. But that bill, there are no copies of that bill available. That bill was never. There, I mean, a few people may still have that bill, but the members had the bill in front of them. This is it was then collected from every one of them as we were leaving, and the bill was never introduced. Again, it was brinksmanship. It was whatever, but it got the point across that hey, maybe selling this road isn't a good idea.
Do you think that the antagonism that existed at that point between the two houses was fed by the recognition of Florio's unpopularity and a belief by Assembly Democrats that they needed to distance themselves from the governor?
I'm not sure if they might have been. I think there was that from both. I think there's always tension between the Senate and the Assembly. Mm-hmm. There's always, it's always there. But that year it was just more. I think there were other things going on, personality issues between some of the players involved. It was tough being a staff person.
I bet.
Because you do want to be collegial with your fellow staff in the Assembly, in the other house, and it was tough. It was tough, but we get it done. Again, we get that budget done early in the morning, and then everybody moved on to the '91 election, which
right. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the second 2 years of the Florio administration, and as you say, being rendered irrelevant. The Democrats lost not only the majority in both the Senate and Assembly, but the Republicans gained veto-proof majorities. And the very first budget that Florio presents, the legislature vetoes. The legislature comes up with its own. Florio vetoes it. The legislature overrides the veto. What is your role at this point?
I actually want to go back. I want to go back to the lame duck session of 1991 and talk about a couple things that might have changed the dynamics of the relationship between Jim Florio and the Republican legislature. After the election, a group of us sat down with then he was still Senate President for 3 more months, with then Senate President Lynch and a few other people.
Who was going to become the minority leader. He had been reelected.
Yeah, he had been reelected.
He was one of the few Democrats who had been reelected.
Remember, and he was just barely reelected because of the NJEA,
right.
And the NJEA was not happy with him because of his support for things, earlier things,
the Quality Education Act,
and he also had taken on the NJEA on some issues. Remember, after that election, the Democratic legislature was almost purely an urban legislature, and in fact, even one of the urban areas we lost seats in Trenton. So it was an urban area where we still didn't. But one of the things that came up in the lame duck session, and it started off as an offhanded comment, which then grew into something. I think maybe a couple days after the election, realizing that it was the taxes that probably, and the anger over taxes. I think also people understood there was the anger over guns too that was there. But the public issue was taxes. And I think somebody made a comment, I still don't remember who it was, in a meeting with John and others, with John Lynch and everything about, and Kathy Crotty and others, well, maybe we should just repeal the whole damn tax package. And it just lay there. Nobody said anything. And then a couple days later, Lynch and staff started talking about, well, maybe this isn't a bad idea. It then cleans the slate. Jim Florio has to come in and work with the Republicans, and either you're going to decimate state government, or there's going to be a realization from the Republicans that some level of tax increases are needed. And the Senate actually, we actually repealed. People forget, we repealed the entire Florio tax package. And it was tough votes for people to do because they understood it, but they understood the problem was that ultimately.
Well, you're throwing the challenge to the new Republican majority, basically.
Yes, yeah. Let them be responsible, and let the governor negotiate from a stronger position. I think for a while it had some legs in the assembly.
How did the governor's office feel about it?
Well, I think there were some that saw the light of it, and then at the end, part of it, no offense to the people that were there, I think they panicked. And they also, along with the incoming speaker, Chuck Atayan, also realized what this meant, and he put pressure on the Democrats in the assembly not to go forward, and it didn't. But it's interesting to see that if it had happened, what dynamics would have changed. But again, it comes from an offhanded. It came beginning with an offhanded comment that nobody took seriously to finally, saying, "Hey, wait a minute, maybe this isn't that bad."
It's really interesting. You're the first person of the 24 or so interviews that we've done who has brought this issue up.
There were that lame duck session became very interesting because there were certain things that Jim Florio needed to get done while he still had a Democratic legislature. One other thing is that a major, and I think that I define this as the first piece of transactional policy that we did, where in order to do one thing you had to do another, and it was more of a highly visible. In that lame duck session, there were the efforts to the Sports Authority was floundering at that point in time. They didn't have, horse racing wasn't raising the money it used to, so it was clearly didn't have enough money to pay its debts. So we knew the state would have to pick up the tab on that eventually. So the state was going to do that. Well, Bill Gormley in South Jersey, he wanted the Atlantic City Convention Center. So that was now packaged. Well, John Lynch and people in New Brunswick wanted the Rutgers Stadium to be, so I said you had these three things that became intertwined, and the view was that we got that through, and we got that through in lame duck. It was it's actually one of the first major pieces of stuff that I actually worked on too.
Did they come under the aegis of the Sports Authority, or did the Sports Authority use bonding to help fund those?
We basically changed the statute for the Sports Authority to say that now you can do a convention center in Atlantic City, you can do the improvements to the Rutgers Stadium. And we got it done. Done in lame duck. There were a number of Republicans who weren't happy with it. Incoming chairman of the Assembly Appropriations Committee, Rodney Freylinghuysen, said, "No. As soon as we get into office, we're going to undo this." What people again, this is probably something nobody has told you. What people didn't realize is that the incoming Senate President, DeFrancesco, and the incoming Speaker were okay with it. So one of the last things that John Lynch and Joe Doria, John Lynch as Senate President and Joe Doria did as Speaker, where there was a lease that needed to be signed. And at that point in time, the Senate President and the Speaker were the ones who signed all leases. There was a lease signed for the Sports Authority to do all the very complex legal document that was signed at, I think, at probably 11:45 on the, so 15 minutes before they were no longer in power. And my understanding is a couple weeks later, when Rodney Freylinghuysen found out what happened, he was just it was just ballistic.
So he ran for Congress.
But what he doesn't know, and he doesn't know, and may not know until now, if he ever watches this. Well, we wouldn't have done that without the sign off of the Senate,
the incoming Republican leadership.
So, but you go back to what happened as a staff, as staffers, the role changes, and members, it changes. He's at 2 years. Like I said, we're total irrelevant. We still have. I think there was still some allegiance to support the governor. There was also some people who were still upset with the governor because hey, you're the reason we're sitting. You're one of the reasons why we're sitting here in the minority, and this view again that maybe he didn't do enough or do what he said he was going to do to help sell the taxes. So that that 2-year period was an interesting dynamic.
One of the things that we've had a couple of roundtable discussions here at Eagleton dealing with the Florio administration, and I think one of the lesser known elements of that administration is that both Governor Florio and former Speaker Chuck Haitayan and former Senate President Don DeFrancesco point to a number of accomplishments during that 2-year period that were quietly done between the unpopular Democratic governor, the veto-proof Republican majority, the primary one apparently being a major overhaul of the welfare system in New Jersey. Was that? Were you involved in that, or is that?
I think there was some part of welfare reform done there, but the major welfare reform happens later with Whitman, I think. But there were some economic development stuff that was done during that
Right.
period of time.
Yes, also.
We were always involved in those things. But again, and we would, the governor's office would work with us, and that's one of the advantages of having a governor's office. You at least in an administration, you at least have as staff people in the minority, and our staff shrunk. Our staff shrunk
Sure.
significantly when we went from the majority to the minority. So now we needed to rely more on them for information. But there were some positives that came out of that 2-year, because at least there's recognition, unlike we've seen in Washington over the last group of years, that hey, we still have to do the people's business. Mm-hmm. And what's good, if it ends up that it helps the governor a little bit, we're still when it comes time for him to run for re-election, we're still going to beat the crap out of him and everything like that, but we still have to do the people's business.
Yeah, I think one of the feelings that came out of the most recent roundtable that included Chuck Haitayan and others from the opposite party who, were at Jim Florio's constant public conflict
Right.
between them. That there was a recognition by everybody around that table that as acrimonious as it was during that period, that it's nothing compared to the acrimony in politics today.
Yes, yeah. Yes, without
there were still friendships across the aisle, and
I think that yes, there was
more
clearly
things
that
could get done.
the collegiality about it. Yeah, so.
All right, so out goes Florio. A 1993 election. He is defeated by 25,000 votes. Christy Whitman comes in. You're still in the minority. What happens now? How do things change in terms of your dealing with the Whitman administration as opposed to the Florio administration?
I think what we now both the Senate Democratic office and the Assembly Democratic office become the loyal opposition to what is going on in a Republican administration and a Republican legislature, and try to develop the points to attack the policies that she's bringing and how we believe they're detrimental to the state, and especially that first year, the first 4 years. The first 4 years is you're also trying to build a record to hopefully not have her reelected. Like you said, she only and people forget Jim Florio's popularity at that time was very, very low due to the tax increases, guns, all the other things you talked. He wasn't a warm and no offense, Jim, wasn't a warm and fuzzy person. All those things. And as you just said, he still only lost by 25,000 votes.
And Whitman, 4 years later, only won.
Yes,
by a very
right. Christy Whitman
margin.
wins 2 elections by less than 50,000 votes. I mean, in 1993, 13,000 people changed their vote. Jim Florio is a second-term governor. Mm-hmm. And who knows how the direction of this state changes, because some of the policies that Whitman puts in a place never become, which may or may not have impacts later on. And you had a second-term governor. That's one of the things I've said in talks that I've done to students or other groups, that one of the things we haven't had in this state since Tom Kean is a second-term governor who really wasn't looking to do something else. And I believe that Jim Florio, as a second-term governor, probably wouldn't have been looking at future elected office. Would he have gone to Washington in a Clinton administration for a cabinet position? Maybe something like that. But what you do as governor isn't going to impact you there. No offense to, again, Christy Whitman, a second-term Republican governor in this state could have done some things that especially on employee benefits and things like that. But she also had her eyes on on Washington, whether it was Jim McGreevey never got the second term,
Right.
John Corzine never got the second term, and we all know that the second term of this administration has been. Again, we need that. It'd be great to see us with that second term. But going back to your question, I mean, we become the loyal opposition. We start looking at. We really start to raise the issues about what we think will be big issues, not only to help us gain back seats in the legislature. We know it's going to take a while to gain back the majorities, but also to counteract what Christie Whitman was doing.
Right.
Why cutting taxes, as great as large as she did, was going to have an impact on property taxes. And I think in that period of time, we really started to play up the property tax impact and trying to say, no, we really need to do more about property taxes, where I'm not sure what the numbers were then, but now where middle class families are paying 8, 10, 12% of their income in property taxes. It was probably still around those percentages back then. About how she was, how she started, really ramping up the debt levels because of how she shifted the transportation trust fund.
Well, let's get into that, because I think that if there's one theme that has remained constant from the beginning, or maybe the second or third year of the Whitman administration, all the way through the current administration, it has been pension benefits, health care benefits, transportation trust fund. Everything seems to always get to crisis proportion before it's even acted upon, and even after it's acted upon, there seems to be a recognition that we're still in crisis. Is that overstating the case?
No, I mean, look, there's gaps in years there where we have some good economic times and things, things aren't as bad. Yeah, but we had, between, and look, and again, going back and correcting history a little bit, people don't realize that actually Jim Florio was the first governor who made changes to the pension system in order to have savings in a budget. There were minor changes. There were changes on how we calculated our state's contribution, but he made a change that lowered that saved him money for the general fund. Christie Whitman does the same thing early on to help pay for her 10% tax cut. We then go into the transportation trust fund, and instead of bringing new money into the fund, it's her first term. She's not going to raise the gas tax. We extend the level of the debt. We keep on going on and on from there. Look, there have been opportunities, especially on the transportation trust fund, and that's timely, because it's something we're dealing with right now. Mm-hmm. There have been missed opportunities on the trust fund from both parties since 1997. I mean, right after Christie Whitman was reelected, there was an opening to raise the gas tax. And I think
now the second lowest in the country, or third lowest in the
whatever.
country?
Yeah, I mean it's the second. Yeah, it's very. There was an opportunity there, and she was even. And remember, this is second term now, so she's not facing the voters again in New Jersey, and there was an opportunity there, and then that fell apart. It fell apart. The Democrats had agreed that we would provide some votes, but the Republicans were going to have to provide the majority of the votes. She went out and made a speech in New York or something, talking about her tax cutting record and how she was a friend of the taxpayers, and it just turned the Democratic leadership off and said, forget it, we're walking away from this deal, which then meant, we have to do other things. I think when we did renew the trust fund that time, we came up with ways to just take more money from the general fund to do it, which places other pressure on the state budget. We didn't do it without, and there was an opportunity with Jim McGreevey in 2003 or 4, where I think we came again close to being
able. And McGreevey, as I recall, publicly came out in favor of raising the gas tax.
I think we came close to having an agreement with the Republicans to provide some votes, because they didn't want to do it with just Democratic votes. And at the last minute, they decided, the Republicans that time decided. In '97, it was the Democrats who decided, no, we're not going to go along with this. In whatever year it was there, but and pensions has been. Like I said, since Jim Florio first, then Christie Whitman with making some changes, and then the infamous pension bond deal of 97.
Well, let's talk a little about that, because I think a lot of people talk about that as being sort of the beginning of the crisis in terms of the pension system. What exactly happened? What did the Whitman administration do?
Someone in the Whitman administration got the idea that if we had a fully funded pension system, that we wouldn't have to make any contributions, and that money could then be used for other things, be it healthcare, healthcare expansions, property tax relief, school funding, whatever it was going to be, it could be used for it. But the way the law was written, the only way you could not make contributions to the pension fund was if you had a fully funded pension system. So probably somebody I'm guessing somebody got the idea, some some Wall Street bankers brought an idea and said, okay, well, if you float 2.8, it's that number again, 2.8. You know, that number in my career, that number 2.8 it pops up a number of times.
Billion.
Yeah, 2.8 billion. If you put 2.8 billion dollars, if you float 2.8 billion dollars of bonds, you know, the system will be fully funded, and you won't have to. And they argued. They said, well, we can get an interest rate on these bonds at somewhere around 7%. And the assumed interest rate that we're calculating for the internal machinations of the pension system was 8 3/4.
So it'll pay for itself.
It'll pay for itself. But the problem was that they weren't related. One was a hard debt. You know, once you borrow a bond, once you go out and issue bonds to people, that's a hard debt that you have to pay. The other piece was amorphous. You could change the interest rate. You could do different things. But you know, they convinced enough. You know, they convinced enough legislators. They got a favorable court ruling. They convinced the NJEA to support it, and I think the NJEA realized that, wait a minute, if we put $3 billion roughly $3 billion into the system, and this grows, we're going to have a very healthy pension. Not only are we going to have a 100% funded pension system, we might have an overfunded pension system, which we can then use to potentially enhance benefits, which does come into it. So that was the theory behind it, and you know, she said, got the legislature to do it. And so then what happened is over the next couple of years, the state didn't have to make pension payments. So instead of making whatever the number was, $400, $500, $600 million a year in pension payments, that money was freed up for other things. But everybody knew at some point in time, we didn't know where. Whenever we would do an analysis, we knew at some point in time the lines would cross and the system would become underfunded. So was that line 10 years out? Was that line 12 years out? Was that line 6 years out? Nobody knew because you didn't know what was going to happen.
Because the obligations from the pension fund were going to increase over that period.
And what you also didn't know was what was going to happen to the value of the assets. In other words, what was going to happen on the stock market. And what was going to happen, more importantly, what ended up happening is what was going to happen on benefit enhancements. And what happened was that because we did have an overfunded pension system, you know, by the year 2000, basically, because that $3 billion grew significantly. You know, the unions, mainly the NJEA first, and then the CWA came on board. And we have to remember at that point in time, I'm not sure if Whitman had left yet, and Senator DeFrancesco was just Senate President, or if he had become governor yet. I think he was still a legislator at that point. You know, they pushed this idea about, you know, hey, well, wait, we have this extra money in the pension system. Let's raise everybody's benefit. Let's change, you know, it used to be a person's pension was calculated by their number of years over 60. Now the number of years of service over 60. Let's change it to the number of years over 55. In the scheme of what was going on in the nation, that wasn't that far removed from what the national averages were.
I should point out that that's the number of years of service over 55 times your average top 3 years of salary.
Right, or 1 year if you were a veteran, things like that. Yes, so they sold this as no cost to the fund. It was just going to use excess assets. Well, what it meant was that line, that magical line of it moved it closer to now, you know, and then what really, you know, so. And look, I said the part of that I thought was sound policy. I thought that moving it to the 55 had some sound policy. What was wrong with that proposal was the fact that people had already been retired. We went and gave them a 9%, because that's what the value of it was about 9%. That change from 60 to 55 was 9%. They could have been retired for 20 years and been receiving cost of living increases every year. We gave them a 9% increase, and I still believe that was because of the impact of the NJEA, which actually is a union that actually cares about its retirees.
I should point out for those people who are either watching this or reading the transcript that the that pensions in New Jersey, teacher pensions in New Jersey, are funded by the state and by the teachers themselves.
Yes.
And that the communications worker, the CWA, is the union that represents the majority of state workers. So it's the state employees and all teachers, all public school teachers in the state, whose pensions we're talking about.
Actually, all local employees also got this 9%
police,
boost as well.
Police,
fire, and local
municipal employees.
But that had some sound policy. But going back and giving retroactive was crazy. I mean, because then it meant, a sound policy would have been, okay, I was an active employee at that point in time. Maybe I had 18 years in the system. Sound policy would have been, okay, my first 18 years are 18 over 60, and every future year would have been
18 over 55.
If I worked there, right, however many years I worked. And the cost of that proposal would have been minimal, where it probably would have been maybe $1 billion. And I'm saying minimal, but in the scheme of a system.
$1 billion here, $1 billion there.
The cost of the other proposal was about $4 billion. And people didn't blink at it because the system was overfunded by about that much money.
Now, what was I mean, was it for votes? Was the motivation for votes, or support of the NJEA?
I think it was a combination of everything. I think the NJ, the New Jersey Education Association, is a very strong advocate for its members, and they really wanted not only the active piece, but they wanted that retiree piece, and they were very convincing to Senator DeFrancesco, who at that point, Senate President DeFrancesco, who in all truth at that point in time was still thinking about running for governor.
After Christy Whitman has left to become the administrator of the EPA.
Or it's in the period time where,
And under the old system, before we elected a lieutenant governor, New Jersey, the Senate President rose to the position of acting governor or governor when a sitting governor left.
So was he motivated by that? Probably. Was he motivated by helping some of his some Republicans that are in Democratic-leaning, strong labor districts, like the 14th district of Senator Verso, in helping protect them? Possibly. The problem becomes is as that policy is actually being developed and as it's being voted on, the stock market had already started to slide. The $4 billion in extra assets were, if you looked back, again, these are all arcane parts of the pension law, where the valuation was back a year earlier. So that's where the $4 billion of excess money was. If you looked at where the system was at that point in time, there probably wasn't $4 billion. Because again, the market had started to come down a little bit, so the assets weren't there. So you go and do this, and then the next year you recognize the real assets, and all of a sudden now, the system is getting, I said that line is getting much closer to reality. So Jim Florio comes in, and all those years of holidays, now all of a sudden you've got to ramp up and go from zero to some $400 or $500 million number.
Jim McGreevey.
Jim McGreevey.
Okay. I thought for a minute that I was completely off there. Okay.
So that yes, your point about that definitely that pension bond issue and how it then impacts the future need to go from 0 to 60, going that fast in a car on pension costs is part of the foundation of what happens during the McGreevey, Cody, Corzine era, coupled with the last budget that the Republicans did before, the Donnie DeFrancesco budget. Well, Whitman proposed it. I think Donnie implemented it. That budget. That you talk about we went earlier talked about how in 1989 everybody knew that there was dark fiscal clouds coming. When that budget was adopted, everybody knew that there were, hurricane force clouds coming because the Office of Legislative Services at that point in time. Remember this is pre-September. This is pre-September 11th. This is in June. This is in May and June of 2001.
During the gubernatorial campaign, when
primary's done, we're about to do. Jim McGreevey is the nominee on our side, Brett Schundler's the nominee on their side. But the Republicans, are doing that final budget, and the Office of Legislative Services is telling them, based on current economic situation, we're thinking publicly they're saying $1 billion to $1.5 billion short. We're going to be $1 billion to $1.5 billion short on revenue. Privately saying that number could be as high as $2 billion.
Is this
unprecedented? The state treasurer, then the acting state treasurer, Pete Lawrence, doesn't come before the committees to provide an update on revenues. Because remember, in that quirk where the Senate president is also the governor. And everybody knew that that was going to. But again, if you go back and read. Even the Democrats in the legislature at that time. I was still at that point in time in June of 2001. I'm still a legislative staff person. If you go back and look at the record on it, we didn't make that big of a deal about it because again, I think the thought was you didn't want the specter of a major economic crisis overhanging a gubernatorial election. It was more, again, a cone of silence was better than anything.
Lesson not learned from 1989.
But what clearly happened then is that again, we all knew.
Was the shortfall that you're talking about on current expense, or was it because of what was going to be owed to make the pension fund whole?
No, that was basically on a revenue side. Basically, that the revenues were not going. The revenues were going to be because of the drop in the stock market, other economic factors going on, that the especially the income tax and things, because our income tax is very, very progressive, very built on high income earners. Even back then, before the increases that Jim McGreevey did later on. It was all on the revenue side. History will show that people will try to go back and blame September 11th attacks for our revenue shortfall, when it was like I said, it was known in May. It was already there. In fact, we may have actually gained a little bit of revenue when people started working more in New Jersey than New York after September. But so there was that. But that then lays, so the combination of that shortfall that's built into that budget that Jim McGreevey is going to inherit. I think most of us, if you go talk to people in the summer of 2001, even on the Republican side, I think everybody realized that Jim McGreevey was probably likely to be the next governor. So I mean, but that shortfall that he was going to have to deal with in his current budget, which had an impact on future budgets because your revenue base is going to be lower, coupled with what was going on with pensions, was going to cause a major disruption. And we actually started. I know, we made an attempt. Again, John Lynch was the minority leader still at that point in time. He made an attempt actually to recognizing what was going on. We actually made entrees into the governor's office to say, look, if you guys want, we will help. If you guys want to propose some cuts, and knowing, we'll help you get the votes, because if you can bring this structural imbalance closer, it helps our guys when they become, when he becomes governor, and hopefully when we get back into the majority. It was rejected mainly by the, I think the Republicans realized this was their last chance to I'll use the word feed at the trough, because if you lose that, I'm sorry, friends.
How about stick it to the incoming governor?
No. It was their last. It was their last chance really to get some. And if you ever look at that budget had one of the world's largest, affectionately known as Christmas trees, with pet projects all over the state and mainly in Republican districts. But what that led to was that in that summer, we quietly put together a group of people. Myself, I believe Sam was involved, Tony Kosha was involved, Rich Keevy, a former OMB director, and I think one or two other people.
Had he already retired at that point?
Yes, Richard retired. Remember, Rich retired in the 90s and then went to Washington for a while.
With the Pentagon.
Yeah, went to the Pentagon for a while. And we quietly put a group of people together that were that started looking at, okay, what will Jim McGreevey face once he's elected?
So
and we met once or twice a week. We met once or twice a month early on. Then started weekly. We weren't meeting in Trenton, so people didn't see this group of people together. We would meet in Tony's office up here in New Brunswick, and started working on, okay, how bad is the situation? And people were amazed that I think sometime within a week of Jim of winning, not of taking office, of winning, of in a week of the election, we had a press conference that basically laid out how bad the situation was. I think there were reporters who knew how it was bad, but nobody ever was able to get anybody to go on the. They would have relied on somebody like me to come to say, "Hey,
you weren't about to go on the record
at that point in time. We weren't ready to do it." But we talk about how bad the situation was, and it was bad. I mean, he was going to inherit a budget that had a couple $2 billion deficit. So not only was he going to have to deal with, looking at a budget that he was going to have to propose for the fiscal year that was going to begin, that would have been in the fiscal year 2003 budget. He also had to do we had to do major triage in 2002. And as it got worse and worse, as we saw more and more of what was going on, things that we had in our pocket to help fix 2003 had to be pulled into 2002, and that then continues the stumbling that then does with some of the policies that we had to do during McGreevey's administration that even I have to look back on and think why did we do that, or why did we do it this way? I like to say in speeches I've made sometimes that in that basically period from '87 to 2010, that I saw and was involved in the good, the bad, and the ugly of state fiscal policy.
Well,
There's a lot of good there too.
Now you made the transition. Was it immediately upon McGreevy's
Yeah,
inauguration?
my private conversations with the governor, with Jim when he was a senator and running for governor, and his staff, and John Lynch, was that when Jim won, I was going to have some role in a new administration to basically come in and honcho the budget. I had no interest at that point in my career. I felt I didn't have the experience yet. I was 40 years old, I guess, at that 41. I didn't think I was ready to be treasurer. I made it clear from the beginning I didn't even want to be considered for treasurer. And there were other more well-qualified people that they were looking at. But I knew then that I was going to become. I'm not sure if I would have invested all that time in the summer and fall, if I knew I wasn't coming in, if I knew, working on it.
Right.
But no, I knew I was going to come in and I was going to be one of the key people on honchoing the budget. First of all, developing the different options for the governor, and then working with my former colleagues on the legislative side to try to get it.
So you become deputy state treasurer.
Deputy treasurer under John McCormick.
Under John McCormick. And how many is there one deputy or are there two?
There's actually one statutory deputy, but most treasurer's offices have had two. They have the statutory deputy. Actually, I wasn't the statutory deputy, and then another. And I basically, my focus was almost entirely on the budget and fiscal issues. The other deputy dealt with the other myriad of things that the treasurer's office does.
And it should be pointed out that a whole bunch of state agencies that when they're created by the legislature, if they can't figure out where to put them, they put them in treasury.
Right.
So there are a whole bunch of unrelated programs that end up under the auspices.
The treasury also has things like what we used to call the mall of state government, where you can get a building, you can get pencils, you can get contract, whatever you need to get, you can get. So there was that whole other. But in my initial part of my
the purchase and property side.
But
of things,
unless it had some budget impact on it, the rest I didn't want to.
So you're basically the lead state treasury person on budget.
Yeah, working with the governor's office and working with the other cabinet officials, because there was not, when McGreevy came in, there weren't many people that he brought in originally that had Trenton experience. A lot of people he brought into the front office,
including John McCormick,
including John McCormick, who was CFO of Woodbridge at the time, and now mayor of Woodbridge. And I think the key thing there was we had a good relationship, and he allowed me the freedom to go and propose if there, and look, and my job was to come up with working with the departments, working with the Office of Management and Budget, my own ideas, whether they were harebrained or good ideas, was to look at these things and say, okay, let's start looking at how do we balance this need where our spending needs are up here and our revenue are here. How do we bring those two things in line?
And what did you do?
And we just started looking. We started looking at everything. And I think one of the things that I think you find out as soon as you get to the executive branch is how much more resources there are there, and how much more information there is there than there is in the legislative branch.
I thought you were going to say the opposite. That once you got to the executive branch, you suddenly realized how little you could actually accomplish.
No. I said how much information there was,
Okay.
And we started to find that out in transition as we started getting access to the O&B staff, the department staff, and you rely on their expertise. You rely on the expertise of the departments. Sometimes departments are forthcoming with ideas. Sometimes they're not, because But you try. After I left as treasurer, I went to a headhunter, and because I was looking at what I would want to do the rest of my life. I was only 50 years old at the time, so I still had another career ahead of me. And I tried to explain exactly this about what I really did for 8 years. And I said, well, I tried to take a cylinder that's this big, which was where our revenue, which is smaller, and our spending, which is a square, which was much bigger than the cylinder, and tried to reshape and reform both of them so they fit together. And I mean, my job was to come up with options. It was ultimately the governor, it's ultimately the governor's view, agreement on what gets proposed. And then look, nothing gets finished unless there's 41 assembly people and 21. And my job was to to develop these different ideas. And we'd look at tax changes. We'd look at, I always wanted to look on the policy side. When I talk to students and groups, I talk about, there's policy concerns, moral concerns, and political concerns. And you would hope those go in a certain order, and sometimes they don't. I mean, you can't take politics out of any decision that's being made by a governor or by a legislature. It's going to creep in about, okay, how does this impact my future election in 2 years if I'm an assemblyman, 4 years if I'm a governor or a senator? How does it? And you just develop these, and you try to look at different fairness issues. I mean, one of the things we came, we really saw that the corporate tax was crashing, and the corporations were paying nowhere near what they paid before, and we did a major corporate tax reform.
Was that one? I mean, I was going to ask you if you could describe the major half dozen or so pieces of how you got that cylinder and that square together.
The first couple of years, and you really have to look at it a couple of year period. The corporate tax reform was one of the major pieces. Making cuts were things that we had to do. Just deciding, wait, we can't afford to do this anymore. In that lame duck session, right before Jim took office, while we were working on these other things and getting ready to take over, the outgoing governor, DeFrancesco, actually was helpful in a number of things, or a couple things that they did in the lame duck session that were things that we knew we wanted to do, and I think they felt some responsibility for what they were leaving us to, so they worked with us on doing some things. I still remember there was one thing we would have liked them to do for us, and they never did. Christy Whitman had created Family Care, great program, which was providing health care for low-income families. But at the point she created it, I don't think she really factored in how fast this program was going to grow. And so you had this program that exploded at the same time the economy was tanking. Mm-hmm. We would have loved, before Johnny left, before Governor DeFrancesco left office, we would have loved, and we tried and we were never successful, we would have loved for him to shut the program down. To basically say no new entries into the program. Because it would have been something like, it's not a very popular thing to do.
No, indeed.
He didn't.
So did you end up doing it?
We not only did we do that, sometime in either that, and my years get mixed up sometimes, but sometime in that first or second year, we actually took 100,000 people off of Family Care. And that's a hard moral decision. But one of the things it does, though, is when you start having discussions with other cabinet members and legislators, and you remind them that, wait a minute, we just, and the Attorney General is talking about the need for more state police cars. And you have, and you're spending a half an hour arguing over whether they should buy 50 cars or 20 cars, and someone in the room, I actually said it at one point in time, say, wait a minute, last week we just took health care away from 100,000 people. Why are we even discussing police cars? When we're making that decision. And actually I remember that conversation, I believe it may have been David Sampson.
I was going to say,
it may have been David at the time who basically said, you know what, let's move on. Same thing. We had to discuss. We had to do things that year like reduce some business grants. And again, it's the same thing. When you start putting these things and start comparing them, when you try. And I think my job as deputy for both McGreevey, Cody, my roles with Corzine, was that in the treasurer's office and in the governor's office, your role is to look at the entire spectrum. The rest of the cabinet is looking with blinders on at their own world, and you have to get them away from that to say, wait a minute, yes, you might be getting cut more than somebody else, but look at what the Department of Human Services has to do and the things that they have to provide and things like that. So it was always, the other big things I think that the most controversial thing that came out of that, or those early McGreevey budgets were. I'm going to go back to what I was talking about, the moral policy and political things. I still remember that, I think it was that first budget, we cut the 100,000 people from Family Care, we cut arts grants entirely, and then we also cut business incentive grants. I still remember getting a call from a legislator, and I'm not going to use the name on this one. He was a dear friend of mine, and he calls me after that first budget. And the first things out of his mouth was reacting to why were we cutting arts and BEEP. But with BEEP was the business employment program, the business incentive tax program. And I may have used some colorful words. And basically said, we just cut 100,000 people from Family Care, and you're calling me about this? And he says, and like I said, I would use some. I had a good enough relationship where I thought I could say. And he says, okay, we'll talk to you later. I later found out, he calls me back and says, oh, by the way, one of the lobbyists from the business committee was in the room when you said that. So that's one of it. But I think one of the most controversial things that came out early in the McGreevey administration was when, and again, it goes into this whole issue of, we talked about it before on pensions a little bit, was debt. How we relied more on debt for transportation, how Christy Whitman, before she left, did the school construction program,
Forgot about that.
which again was a very sound policy that had some flaws. And the sound policy was, hey, the court had ordered we had to pay for these Abbott district schools at 100%. Did we have to pay for Taj Mahals at 100%? Were there flaws in how it was implemented? Was another. But what people don't realize that also was part of that is we took suburban schools that were getting maybe less than 5% in the past for their capital programs. We didn't raise them to something like 20%, which they would have been ecstatic over. As we're moving this bill, I'm going back to 1999 here briefly, because I think it's another one of these things where things happen that have a longer term effect. School districts that were getting 5 and we're now going to 20 would have been ecstatic. But again, the powers, the wisdom of the legislature was, oh no, let's not go to 20, let's go to 40. So now all of a sudden you took a program that probably could have been a $5 or $6 billion program, and it turned into a $9 billion program. So it's just.
And as I recall, there were a couple of Taj Mahals and a couple of major problems with environmental cleanup of certain. You had issues of. And look, the McGreevey administration had to administer it. Whitman started it, the McGreevey administration, and yes, there were clearly some mistakes made. And you had issues where in Newark where the mayor was selling the piece of land to the school board instead of for $1, which you would think that intergovernmentally maybe you would do or something, at an exorbitant price to help balance his own budget, because he knew that the state was paying for it, and those things happened. But as I say, I think one of the more controversial things with the early in the McGreevey administration, and it set the trend for some other things we had to do. Because again, we're going back again. We're focused on trying to deal with pension increases, revenues laying out. Yes, we did corporate tax increases, cigarette tax increases, things like that. But the key thing was, again, this was a lot of these things start on Wall Street. There was it had just started a nationwide. It started in a couple states, and New Jersey was like one of the second or third states. In the late 90s, there was a settlement reached with the tobacco industry. With the federal government and all the states. So basically, all the states and the federal government had sued the tobacco industry and said, wait a minute, you're costing our state budgets billions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars, in the case of probably New Jersey, in healthcare related costs, either through our Medicaid program, our employees' healthcare, wherever it is, because of smoking. And ultimately, the tobacco industry settled and set up a trust fund basically, and set up a settlement that said, okay, state, however the formula was, state X, New Jersey, you're going to get between $250 and $300 million a year forever, as long as the cigarette industry is still in business. Again, some Wall Street, brain thinks, wait a minute, who knows if this money's really, who knows if these people are really going to be there 20 years from now? Let's shift the risk from the taxpayers, because it's the taxpayers' risk that they go away, to bondholders. So let's go out and sell this settlement. Just like, look, you see ads on Time all the time, where if you win a settlement, you win your lottery or something, you can go out and maybe for 80 cents on the dollar or whatever, get your money right away.
You can get your money right away, and hopefully you don't squander it. So we were, it was a complex deal, but we went out and got close to $3 billion for our future for roughly 40 years worth of thing. I think a lot of us, we were hoping that $3 billion would last more than 2 years, but it's just the way that the economy kept on going, programs, decisions we weren't willing to make or whatever, we ended up burning that money out in 2 years. Again, thinking back, hindsight, shifting the risk from the state taxpayers to bondholders was the right thing to do, but what we should have done in an ideal world, and again, I think budgeting is not an ideal world in this state, under either party, what we should have done is we should have taken that $3 billion, put it into an account, and every year only drew down what we were supposed to get from the tobacco industry. So if we were only supposed to get $250, we only draw down 250. You could have done things plus or minus 20% and then make it up. We didn't. We burn it in 2 years. So then we get to Jim McGreevy's third year, 2004, I guess. Yes, I mean Jim is wounded. I mean clearly Jim is wounded by that point in time because of the taxes, everything that's going on, and also
his personal life
and their personal life was
right.
going on, and I think I think we realized that that if he didn't make a turn with that budget, which is with his third budget, that he was probably going to face primary opposition the next year. So we just our direction basically. And look, my direction as deputy treasurer, and the treasurer's direction comes from what the governor says he wants to do and what the governor's staff say they want to do. And we wanted to do a budget that wasn't that didn't do any that tried to maintain services and didn't have any dramatic cuts. And we came up with a way to basically bond for operating costs. And, basically issue bonds off of cigarette tax revenue or motor vehicle revenues that were basically funding the budget. Because the reason we needed to do it is because for the 2 years prior to that we had burnt all the tobacco money. So we had $1.5 billion or built in that went away. So that was the key of that budget. That budget also was when finally Jim did agree late in that budget process to increase the income tax. Because remember, all the taxes we raised early on, we had never really touched the income tax. We did a lot of good things. I mean, we raised the rebate levels and things like that, other things, but we didn't raise the income tax at that yet. So that third year in negotiations with the legislature,
raised the top end.
Raised the top rate, for people above 500,000 at that point. At that point in time, the joke was everybody called it a millionaire. Everybody called it a millionaire's tax, but
it was a $500,000.
It was $500,000, and so that's Trenton speak. But that again, we build a budget on those things, on that deficit spending, which went to court. Senator Lance takes it to court, and in another one of the great decisions of the Supreme Court, instead of and now
this is the New Jersey Supreme Court.
This is New Jersey Supreme Court. They say this is illegal. Don't do it again. Right. So they basically let us use the money because they thought that it would create chaos. Now, again, what happens in that time period, though, is that either right around the decision or either prior or right after the decision, Jim McGreevy resigns in August of 2004. So, everything that we had done to try to, protect him goes out because of and that was clearly not because of any of his policy issues, but that was all the personal side. But and this and like we jokingly say to the court, why didn't you stop us? Stop us. We would have rather had to deal with it then than you saying, oh no. And then Dick Cody comes in and has to deal with it.
Now your resume says that you were deputy state treasurer for those 2 years of the McGreevy administration, and then you were a special assistant.
I was deputy all through the first. I was deputy through all three McGreevy
and Cody.
Okay. My resume. We'll talk about it. I go back, but I stay on when Dick becomes.
Oh, I thought when you became a special advisor to the Senate president that was Cody.
No. It is later, but it's not. It's not. No, right. John McCormick stayed on as treasurer. I stayed on as deputy treasurer.
I see.
It's strange. I really didn't have, when I was in the Senate, I didn't have Senator Cody was a minority leader towards the tail end. Remember, he became minority leader in 2007. After the 2007 elections, he became minority leader. So he was a minority leader in 8, 9, 10, not 8, 9, 10, 2000 and the end of the administration. He was minority leader. But but the way they split the duties up, Bernie Kenny did all the budget stuff. So Senator Kenny. So I didn't deal with Senator Cody much. So when he becomes governor, I had a relationship with him, but not as So and things just flowed the same way. We had the same team, different team in the governor's office, but my role stayed the same. Was just give you ideas, and that first budget, that first and only budget that he ended up doing, we came down to a decision between two things. At the end, we had about a $500 or $600 million shortfall after we did everything. After we looked at everything in the mix, and it came down to: do we raise the sales tax or do we cut rebates? I think at that point in time, when we made the decision to to cut rebates, to try to bring spending levels down. I think at that point in time, Senator Cody had made the decision he wasn't going to run, because I think he saw the writing on the wall about about how popular, or how John Corzine had worked to probably ensure the nomination.
Right.
And also he started looking, okay, if I start bringing spending down, that helps the next administration. Mm-hmm. And it was an interesting discussion with the assembly that year, because remember, now at that point in time, that's another one of these weird situations where Senator Cody is the Senate president
and the governor.
So he in essence is in charge of two of the three players in the budget process. Mm-hmm. But we got through that budget. There was some consternation. We ended up not cutting rebates as far. Senator Cody actually, again, looking forward to the future, and understanding what is going on with pensions and how it's becoming harder and harder for us to pay for them. Commissioned a study, which now gubernatorial candidate Phil Murphy chaired, and it came up with some recommendations that became part of some of the discussions on pensions in the Corzine administration So I stayed through the Corzine. There were some. Through Cody.
Uh-huh.
There were some things that there were some things we did in the budget during that period of time that caused consternation for people later on. I'm trying to be as honest as I can in this. We did, as I mentioned historically there was always things called Christmas trees in the budget, where there would be individual line items, a firehouse somewhere here, Boys and Girls Club here. One of the things that during the McGreevey administration,
Congress they called earmarks.
Yeah, earmarks. Yeah. One of the things in the McGreevey administration that we did, we changed because of the fiscal situation. We turned around and said, wait a minute, if we're cutting I'll go back to family care all the time. I'll say if we're cutting $100,000 of people from family care, how the hell can we dare say we're going to give money to a firehouse? Right. So we created these block grant programs, and I had a concern from the beginning on what was going to happen there. We had block grants in human services, DCA, whatever, and then people would apply for the grants, and DCA would make the decision, or Human Services,
Department of Community Affairs,
Department of Human Services, whoever would make the decision. That process didn't work as well as the legislature wanted it to do, and in a fateful decision, and I guess it was McGreevey's last budget. We brought all those grants into the treasurer's office, and Treasury was going to administer them. I warned McCormick about it, that it was not a good idea, but I think he got something else somewhere else from people, and it later became, they were all, Wayne Bryant went to jail from it. Senator Coniglio went to jail because of it. I spent hours and hours before grand juries on it. It was infamously known as the MAC account, where we had $80 million that was basically, the legislature would develop a list and say, here's what it is. And that's one of the things I just, like I said, it took years. It was not a fun process to be across the table from Chris Christie's staff as a U.S. Attorney's office answering these questions.
You've described. I want to try and pull this all together over the period of time that you've been talking about, starting with the Florio administration all the way up to McGreevey, Cody. You've described a whole series of actions that have taken place that had short-term benefit for the politicians, had short-term fixes for the budget, but appear to have gotten us into positions that have made it more and more difficult to balance the budget as years have gone by. Is that a fair assessment?
I would say I would add one more thing. They provided short-term benefit to the people who needed those services and programs at that time.
Fair enough.
And hoping that that at some point in time the economy. I think there was always this thing that, okay, the economy will grow faster and we'll be able to get. But it becomes a cycle that you then can't get yourself out of, because who's going to be the one who's going to be the governor who then stands up and says, okay, I'm going to bite the bullet.
Well, Jim Florio would argue that he was that governor, and I'm
going to go a step further and go to the next administration and talk about when John Corzine first came in. And he basically said, no, I'm going to start making at least I'm going to start making significant pension payments and start doing this. I'm going to raise taxes I'm going to do some things to bring structural balance to the budget. Now, personally, what had just to get us in timeline, what happened with me is that during John Corzine's elected governor, I'm still with Dick Cody. There was a period of time where, in that transition period, where I didn't know what was going on. There was truthfully, I was working a little bit with the transition team on issues, and I had some people telling me that they were going to keep me on, some people telling me they weren't. So I'm in a weird transition. I'm working on things. Well, if they don't keep me on, what am I going to do? I had one outside thing I was working on, and then ultimately it was decided, and later I found out more. It was they wanted to break ties with the past, with the McGreevey, Cody era. And they decided, not to keep me on in my position as deputy treasurer. The outside thing I was working on fell through. Dick Cody and Kathy Crotty says, "Look, come, because now Dick and now Senator Cody and I had developed a great relationship. As him being governor and me being the deputy, because I think we worked very well together."
So you went back to the legislative staff.
And that's where I go back as a special advisor to the Senate president. And the agreement was that I would stay at least 6 months to get through to help them with that first budget, because now I had a wealth of knowledge.
Right.
And I knew the questions to ask. I knew when a governor's office or a treasurer's office says, "No, we don't have that," they know if I'm sitting in the room next to Dick Cody, they can't say that because I say, "No, it's right there," or I had brought all my files.
Right.
But I work. That and the agreement was 6 months, and then after that, if I found something. And what happened?
What you found was state treasurer.
Well, there was a stop in between there. But what I was saying is, I talk about that when John Corzine came in, that first budget he does do, he raises the sales tax, expands it to a few more services, says I'm going to make at least over $1 billion pension payment, which was somewhere in the 55 to 60% of what we should make. So he went from almost nothing to that, and bit the bullet.
So there's your 0 to 60.
Right, and bit the bullet, and tried to say, okay, I'm gonna tackle this. I'm gonna use my fiscal acumen from Wall Street and my other thing, and I'm gonna try to tackle this. And I think the Senate was more on board that year with what he was doing. The Assembly, again, I think more of it was thinking back to 1991, thinking back to then, and we're concerned about raising, especially raising the sales tax, because the sales tax is the broadest tax we have in this state, and impacts everything you do. And it was strange. Like I said, I being told you're not going to stay on gives you some feelings of hey, you'll feel good about that, but like I said, I landed with Cody, but it was strange. I started developing a very good relationship with the person who took my place, who came in as treasurer, because I was deputy treasurer, but Brad Abelow, and he and I talked. He and I developed a good relationship. I still, and I knew some of the people within the governor's office. I still hadn't really met and talked with John Corzine that much at that point in time, and I developed a good relationship with him. And then when they put together a budget that that really was It was a decent budget. It was they really didn't have any. One of the things that I always tried to do is when I was developing budgets is not just look only at February when you present the budget, but look at where you want to be in June, and set things up for the fact that knowing that you're going to have to deal with the legislature on certain things, so you need to keep things in your back pocket and things like that to go. I'm not sure if they had that hindsight. I think they tried to do more of a pure approach, saying no, this is what we should do, and we're going to stick to our guns. And so I during that spring, that's the spring where we where the Assembly basically said, part of the Assembly, mainly the South Jersey contingent, said no, we're not going to raise the sales tax, and there was and that led to eventually the shutdown, and that's where my shift going back to the executive branch takes place again, because Senator Cody was really aligned with John Corzine on this issue. I started working more and more with the treasurer's office and work. I almost went. It was odd. I talk about, and when I talk to students or other groups, I talk about the separation of powers. Forget it. There was a point in time when I was working for half the day I'd be working down in the legislative staff building, and then the other half of the day I'd be up in the treasurer's office involved in meetings, just like I had never left. I mean, there was. So I remember one day walking in, we were doing something, and it felt like I hadn't left, but I still was working for Senator Cody.
Right.
And so I got back involved, and I started to get to know, so I was part of that inner circle that actually, tried to work out that final budget and what we finally got to an agreement. There were hiccups. There were a lot of, the assembly. I still remember a meeting at Drumthwacket where the assembly put a whole bunch of tax proposals on the table. Alternatives to the sales tax. The governor wasn't interested in them. The Senate president wasn't interested in them. We joke that they proposed them at sunset and they were dead by sunrise. Somehow that night they got leaked to people who would have been. Well, there were a number of reporters hanging. Somehow reporters knew the meeting was going on, and somehow some reporters got a hold of them, and and by that morning, and there was some controversy. There was some tension that occurred out of that. The assembly really felt burnt, and I think that helped. That caused more tension. But ultimately, what came to that budget year was it came down to, eventually we came to an agreement that half of the sales tax was going to be used for the budget, and half of it was going to be used for future property tax initiatives. And ultimately, we work out that framework. And what people don't realize is that once you work that framework out, there's still all the detail that has to be done on a budget. So we go into a meeting probably around 5 or 6 o'clock at night, trying to work out all the other details. Say, okay, now we're going to do this, this, and this. Problem was, we didn't have a pre-meeting. Like, I wanted to have a pre-meeting where I got the governor, Senate President Cody, people like Kathy Crotty, and others into a room and say, okay, how are we going to handle this? We didn't. We get into this meeting cold. And halfway through the meeting, and we're trying to still make cuts, even though, to balance a budget. And halfway through this meeting, I had a laptop. This is great now. Now we used to have pencils and paper. Now I have a laptop in front of me with a spreadsheet where somebody's saying, well, no, the entire first hour discussion wasn't about cuts. It was about where people wanted to spend money. And all of a sudden I lean over to Brad Abelow, who's next to me. I said, Brad, we don't need a penny increase in the sales tax anymore. We need 2 cents because of all this. And then it brought it back to reality. But it took us almost 18 hours to negotiate this. And at one point in time we split. And I still remember this to this day. We're in the treasurer's conference room, and we're about $40 or $50 million off, which isn't a lot of money from where we started. Governor Corzine takes me to the side room and says, "Okay, if you were working for me right now, what would you do?" I said, "Governor," I said, "we could stay here for 4, 5, 6 more hours, and we can drop $40 or $50 million down to $20 or $30 million. But you have to realize at some point in time, as governor, you're the one you have to assume some risk in the budget." And he said, "You have to decide: is it worth 4 or 5 hours more hours of your life, to find $20 million more in savings, or is it better to just, cut and learn?" And he agreed with me, and we did it. We did something with the revenues to say, okay, we had a $600 or $700 million surplus, so it was a viable risk. The problem is that we had shut down government. We had shut down government for 7 days. We had state employees were staying home. State parks have been closed, and we then go out and present a budget that had a couple $100 million in, we'll use the word earmarks, or all of a sudden, there's extra money for Trenton, there's extra money for Newark, there's extra money for this, and the Republicans really did their job as the loyal opposition and highlighted that. So basically, this: you shut down government, and then you're still doing this, and this. And by the time that the vote was, by the time it was done that night, yes, we passed. It passed both houses. I forget what time it was. I leave the State House. I'm still a Senate staff person. I had discussions about already coming back. That they were pretty clear discussions that I was going to come into the administration in July. It was just a matter of when. I go home. I go to sleep, and just rest. And my phone rings. My wife, I ignore it. Then the House phone rings, and it was Brad Abelow, who's the treasurer at the time. Now remember, I said I still technically work for the Senate. The people who had sent the bill to the governor, the people who had put things in the bill that the governor, that the Republicans had railed on, And so Brad calls me and says, the governor wants you to come in and work on the line item veto. I said, wait, you want me to come in and work on the line item veto of the things that my my employers have put in? He says, yes. I said, well, look, let me call. I said, I got to call Dick first. I got to call Senator Cody first. And I don't know if I got Tim or if I got Kathy, or it was clear. I said, no, go in. So I spent that day, we're working with them, and I still remember at one point in time where we came up with what he thought was a reasonable amount, that he and his policy people and some of his press people thought was a reasonable amount to cut. And I still remember one of them that then we sent it to the Senate President and the Speaker, and we got a reaction from them about nah, we don't like that, and again, I think Joe Roberts is one of the greatest minds I've seen in politics, but there was something that he objected to, and the governor's office was likely to agree with him, but he had said, okay, I want this funded, and why don't you cut this more? Well, the cut this more happened to be something in Essex County, so I actually, because again,
which is Dick Cody's home county.
Yes,
as opposed to
the other one was something. The other one happened to be in something in Camden County, and I said for the last month, Dick Cody has been one of your strongest supporters on here, and now you're going to go and screw him at the last minute. He said, I don't care if you go and give Joe Roberts this project, but don't you dare take it out of Dick Cody's money. And I said, look, just if you want it, fine. Find another $1 million, whatever it was, somewhere else. And so, like I said, I didn't know if it didn't work out. Me going to work for them, I would have stayed to work for the Senate.
But at this point, obviously, the governor is beginning to show some interest in you.
And I think and
when Brad Abloh leaves, you.
Well, no, actually, even go before then. I go as
back as deputy.
You never go. They never go back to your old title.
I got you.
So that's where I go back. I go back basically functioning in a very strange role. I reported not only to Brad, but I directly reported to even though I was technically in the treasurer's office, I had direct access to the governor, and I was part of the seniors, I guess I was considered part of the seniors, and I had this title of senior advisor for fiscal policy to the governor. But reality was I was acting as deputy treasurer, and then I did that for the end. But what I think the other thing that I like to talk about that I think that was the best I've ever seen, I don't know how. The best I've ever seen of state government, and then I'll get to a couple other things just to close my career. After that shutdown, the agreement was that we were going to do a special session on property taxes, and that started in the fall of 2006. Summer of 2006 it actually started, and it was basically an agreement with the Senate President and the Speaker and the governor's office that we were going to focus on 4 or 5 different areas. On property taxes and employee benefits and some other areas, and basically it was made clear to members, this is not a press release opportunity. This is be serious, and some of the stuff that came out of that was good stuff, and I think that some of the things that happened in those couple years, that the first 2 years of the Corzine administration, and then the third year where I become treasurer, we laid a sound. By raising the taxes, getting pensions up to at least 50% in every one of those budgets, we laid a sound framework, and we were moving. I mean I become treasurer in January of 2008, right after the school funding formula was approved in 2007.
Right.
And I become treasurer, and that first budget that we do, it cut spending. It had non-recurring revenues were down to about $500 million, which was a small number in concern. We had some record levels of property tax relief out there. In the rebate programs that we had. We had a pension payment of over 50%. We had revenue estimates that were blessed by the Office of Legislative Services and blessed by Wall Street. This is June of 2008. And so we thought, wow, this is good. We're on track here. And in the fall of 2008,
everything falls apart.
Everything falls apart. Yeah. That budget that we adopted in the fall of 2008, by the time the fiscal year ended, the revenues were almost $5 billion less than what were projected. So during that year, we were doing triage every single day to keep, because people forget, people don't understand that the state unlike the federal government, has a balanced budget, constitutionally balanced budget. And it doesn't mean constitutionally balanced budget on the day you sign it. It has to stay constitutionally balanced throughout the year. So if your revenues drop and they drop to below your surpluses, you've got to find offsetting cuts or offsetting. And that year, I mean, it was the capping of my career as treasurer, but I become treasurer at the point in time where I would have never, no one had seen the economic situation ever, unless you had lived through the recession. And government was so, and what we had to go through that year, and then the developing the 2009 budget, that was, it was sheer hell, the choices that you had to make, and and the decisions on what you were going to cut or what you weren't going to be able to fund, just it was totally unprecedented, we I had great staff at OMB, but it was things that because of that constitutional requirement, unlike Washington, it was things we had to do. So we knew, people were saying, well, how are you going to do it? We said, we'll do it. Look, we had $1 billion pension payment. That was the first thing to say, look, we would like to make this, but we're probably not going to be able to make it. All these things. And then when we come into that last year, we're at that point in time, clearly, because of the economy and things like that, again, John Corzine's facing a situation where, hey, my political future is on the line. And, with that budget, which is where he raised the income tax on people above $1 million, and because New York had raised it. One of the things that people don't realize is the interaction of tax policy among the states. I think it was that year the state of New Jersey was going to lose $300 million because New York raised its tax rates. So what's going to happen is people who lived in North Jersey who worked in Manhattan were going to first pay New York before they got to pay us. So there's something, we lose $300 million in the midst of a recession that had nothing to do with us. So we do that last budget, which included the so-called millionaires tax increase, and we also had the benefit of the federal government. Obama had come into office already because
and you had the stimulus.
We had the stimulus money. I think the intent of the stimulus money from the federal government was to go a few years. Due to political considerations, we used almost all of it in one.
Well, you had to balance that budget.
To balance that budget in 1 year, we used almost all of it. We also thought in the back of our minds that and look, at that point in time, we're all still thinking that yes, it's going to be a tough race, but we still thought that John was going to win and have that second term. And have that 18 months maybe at the beginning of a second term where maybe we could really do with some Republicans, because we knew there were some Republicans that were willing to do some things and really bite them and even do more. To have that second term governor that I mentioned before, and we also thought that there might be a second stimulus package, because in 2009 when the stimulus is done, there's only 2 governors running for election, and none of the U.S. Senate and Congress is running. 2010. You have a whole lot more governors running, and a third of the Senate and all of the House running. We're thinking, okay, there'll be a stimulus package. So yes, we did it. It made a bigger hole for Christie when he came in. Yes, we did make the millionaires tax only a 1-year tax. There was some debate among that for people, I'm going to be open and honest on this. There were a number of people who had lived through 1991 and saw that Jim Florio raised $2.8 billion in taxes, and Christie Whitman got the benefit of this. Christie Whitman didn't repeal the Republicans never repealed many of those taxes. They lived off of those taxes. So, in all honesty, there were people in the room when we were doing the millionaires tax who said, why aren't we making this permanent? There was a group of people who had lived through 91. I was one of them that said, no. We should make this a one. First of all, policy-wise, we don't know the impact of it. We don't know. Let's make this a 1-year tax. If I think then our conversation was, when John is reelected, we can relook at it. Maybe do it again. Maybe do something less, do more, whatever. Because the election would have been a referendum on that. And then in the back of the minds, there were some of us that are saying, well, if he doesn't, and God forbid if he doesn't win, hey, it's it's payback for what Tom Kane left Jim Florio, Donnie DeFrancesco left Jim McGreevy, and look, and there was, and that's and I'm not proud to say that, but no, but it's politics. Like I said, politics is part of this, and so I mean, and then of course, by that point in time in my career, I'm thinking, okay, and I had conversations with the governor throughout that, that if he won, I wanted to stay at least one, if not 2 more years as treasurer, because I really believed that we had an opportunity in the first 18 months of a second term, before people start focusing on the legislative elections that would have occurred, and then start focusing on the gubernatorial, that we had an opportunity to do some things, to restructure government, to do something on property taxes, to do something, to really good things in 18 months, and I wanted that to be the capping of a career that started, in '87, really in the legislature, on policy issues that I had dealt with. Of course, the voters decided that we didn't deserve that, and there's a couple things that happened in the lame duck session that since I just want to get, it gives me opportunity to get some of them off my chest. Lame duck sessions are always very, very, very interesting, because you have the outgoing people trying to land themselves jobs, and people incoming, and I was in a unique situation where, as long as I was doing my job, which meant trying to keep the budget balanced, I had an ethics opinion, and basically I couldn't talk to anybody that had anything to do with any funding. So it was a very strange. I could have said, okay, I'm going to start talking to this person, which means I'm going to recuse myself from doing my job. And I made the decision that I was going to work right up until the 20th. We made the decision that we were going to recognize whatever shortfall was there at that point in time, and we were going to balance it. We weren't looking out into the future yet, because truthfully, if we had won re-election, we wouldn't have looked at the future until January or February anyway. Right. But a couple of things that happened during that lame duck session that they're interesting is 3 things happened during that session. Lame duck period. Clearly, there was a decision in meetings with John Corzine and the incoming Democratic leadership, which was going to be Steve Sweeney, Sheila Oliver, and others, that the first that Christie was going to have a mess to deal with in his first budget. That everybody was in agreement that let him pass, let him own it. Give him a couple votes what you need to make sure government doesn't shut down, but let him own anything and let him take the consequences. The consequences never came. I mean, he ended up making cuts that were much more dramatic than we had ever done on things like municipal aid, school aid, rebates, and the outcry just wasn't there. I mean, I don't know if people were afraid of him. I think part of it is, no offense to my friends in the press corps that I still have, the press corps in New Jersey politics in our papers is nothing like it was 10, 15 years ago, which let him get away with a lot of things, so there wasn't that outcry. I remember we made a $5 or $10 million cut in municipal aid at one point, maybe in the fall of 2009, and the then executive director of the League of Municipalities said this is a knife to the throat of property taxpayers. Mm-hmm. Chris Christie cuts them by $200 or $300 million, and it's a whimper. I mean, what we all miscalculated was that there wasn't going to be that everybody thought there would be this uproar because it was always against us, mm-hmm. and that he would be so wounded in that first year that he would never recover, and he didn't. The other 2 things that before we close and on that lame duck session is that it's sometimes the hypocrisy of government and candidates and you had an election that was basically, and Republicans for 8 years blasting Democrats and blasting John Corzine for debt increases, and truth be told, the only debt that John Corzine increased was school construction and transportation trust fund. He didn't do, yes, Jim McGreevy did pension bond, and Jim McGreevy did, tobacco securitization. He did debt, but John Corzine, that I had a meeting during transition with very high-level people in the Christie administration that were doing doing the budget stuff. And early in the spring every year, we have to issue our bonds for the Transportation Trust Fund to keep it going, to fund the projects that are out there. So Chris Christie was going to have to issue bonds probably in February or March. They came to me, and a staff person that I knew very well and knew me said, "Don't." He said, keep your reaction calm," because he knew how I was going to react. He said, "We would like you to issue the debt for the trust fund before you leave." Mm-hmm. And I reacted, "Wait a minute, you've spent the last, during the campaign, pardon my language, kicking the shit out of us on debt, and now you want us to do this." And actually, I was just like beside myself. I was even more beside myself a half an hour later when my press secretary comes in and says, as that was happening, the governor was holding another event, blasting us on debt.
The incoming governor.
The incoming governor.
Uh-huh.
Now, I got a call a little later from the people who were in the room, says, "We didn't know that was going on. That was off script." So at least that part. But I just thought it was and I actually convinced Corzine and others that we shouldn't do it. That what better thing for everybody was for everybody, even for the state, was for Chris Christie to have to issue debt early in his administration,
or make some decision about the
transportation. And he was going to have to issue. He was not going to shut down, but to do that. And I came very close to, and ultimately at the end something happened. I'm not going to talk about what actually happened, but we folded, and I did issue the debt before I left. And there's just two more things that the other two things that they could have changed. This one could have actually changed some of the early era of the Christie administration. We quietly made a proposal to people in the Christie administration that we would be willing to work with them on actually extending, before we left, extending the millionaire's tax. Because it was going to expire at the end. Right. People always blame, and this is why people always blame Chris Christie for cutting taxes on millionaires. No, he didn't cut taxes on millionaires. We made it only a one-year tax. When the legislature tried to renew it, he didn't do it. But we made an overture to them to say, and it would have made a significant difference in his first budget, because he would have had close to $1 billion more in revenue. And so instead of having to make up the loss of $1 billion in income tax revenue and $1 billion in stimulus money, he would only have to do one, and maybe he doesn't have to cut rebates as far. Maybe he doesn't have to cut school aid as much. He takes the issue off the table of protecting millionaires.
Right.
And again, I think that.
And he can blame his predecessor for it.
And look, we were willing to do a year, 2 years, whatever,
right.
But there would have to have been Republican votes to help do it. The staff who was involved in putting the budget together was intrigued. Mm-hmm. My understanding is that other people involved in his administration said no and
right.
didn't. So,
right.
But.
Well, this has been a very, very comprehensive,
yes.
chronological look at your career.
There's one story I just want to finish with. It'll take 2 minutes, sure. And I think it's what put all this into perspective. One of my last remarks, one of the last public appearances I made as treasurer, was here on the Douglas campus to a group of government accountants, and it's the second week in December or so. And a couple days before that, I had and I think one of the things I'm most, I talk about the good, bad, and ugly I've seen. And I think the good is that I don't think people understand that what we do, and it's been all governors, and I'm not, some governors are Democrats and Republicans. The good we do in this state, especially for the people who need it the most, the poor, the developmentally disabled, the people that are sitting out in our group homes, all those, that group of people, that underlying part of society, I think that people sometimes forget unless you have a direct connection to it. So about sometime in early December, the ARC wanted to come in and give the governor something, thanking him. The governor wasn't available, so I took his place, and they came in, these 2 adorable little girls who had some type of developmentally disability. I can't remember what it was. I still have the picture in my office. Coming with this thing of balloons that they had made, just to thank us for everything we did. So as I'm making those last remarks to the set of government employees, government accountants, a couple weeks later, I said the other day everything was put into perspective for me. I said, after years of listening to whiny mayors, whiny school board presidents, whiny college presidents, uncooperative fellow cabinet officers. I said it all came into perspective though when these two little girls came in and gave me a hug, and I think that's what I like to remember about my whole career in government.
I can't think of a better coda to this interview.
Thank you.